Hello and welcome to Lonely Passions, the Brainmoor Centenary Fest. Today we are absolutely delighted to have with us Glenn Patterson, who's a writer based here in Belfast, and Annie Murray, who's the archivist in the University of Calgary. Annie is going to take us through some of Brainmoor's archival materials, with a particular focus on the writing of Judith Hearne. We hope you enjoy.
Hello everybody, my name is Glenn Patterson. I am a novelist from Belfast. I'm also the director of the Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's University, and I'm actually talking to you from the Seamus Heaney Centre in Queen's University. And if you're wondering why I'm infringing all the rules of Zoom events and sitting in front of a pane of glass with light behind me, it's because if I kind of slide down like this, and you might be able to see, apart from me getting up with difficulty from my seat. What you saw at the back there was University Road, and behind that, Camden Street, where Judith Hearne lodges in the Lonely Passion of Judith Hearne. We are here for Paradoso Presents Lonely Passions, Brainmoor Centenary Festival, and I'm delighted to say that my role in this is to talk to Annie Murray, who is head of rare books and special collections in archives and special collections at the University of Calgary. So, hi Annie, how are you?
Hello.
Great to see you. And maybe we could just begin by you telling us a little bit about what the connection is between Brainmoor and the University of Calgary.
Sure. Well, first of all, hello to everyone who's at the festival, and happy centenary. Brainmoor. Now, I just said Brian because growing up in Canada, with novels such as The Lonely Passion of Judith Hearne and Black Robe, which was about Jesuits and the Indigenous peoples, I thought, how Canadian can you get? So it was only as I grew older I realized he was Brainmoor. Why are Brainmoor's archives in Calgary? The University of Calgary is a fairly young Canadian university, and in the early and mid 70s, there was sort of a period in Canada of literary nationalism and sort of a beginning of a real critical and cultural celebration of Canadian writing. And part of that in Calgary was they thought, how can we make our new university's library distinct or interesting? What hadn't been happening in Canada was the systematic collection of writers' archives in a Canadian institution. It was still very much oriented around the celebration of Anglo, European or American literature. And as Canadian literature was finding more of a footing through sort of federal grants, programs, and awards, poets working in the universities, the University of Calgary thought, well, what we can offer in our library is they wanted to create something called the Archives of Canadian Creativity.
Annie, can I just at this moment, because I so badly did I introduce everything and concentrating too much and sliding out of my chair and getting back into it. What I neglected to say, of course, is that Brainmoor, born in Belfast, but emigrated to Canada in 1947, 48.
Yep.
So, and had been living in Montreal and published his first half dozen novels, I guess, while he was living in Canada, which is where your university's archive comes in.
Yes. So now we've got the map. So Brainmoor emigrates in the late 40s. He starts working at the Montreal Gazette. He's living in Montreal. He's writing commercial stories. He's writing pulp novels, and he's starting to write his serious fiction, as he calls it, while he's living in Montreal. And then he by the time Calgary sort of thought, you know who else should be in our archive? He was living in California, but he had made a big impression in Canada. And in fact, the copies I have of some of his novels, these are all published as part of the first and second generation of the new Canadian Library, which was sort of part of this literary nationalism which was sort of like, let's canonize a Canadian body of work. So Brian Moore was very much accepted and celebrated as this Canadian writer. And then his friend, Mordecai Richler, who he got to know in Montreal and spent a lot of time with, Richler's archives came to Calgary in 1974. And just as Richler encouraged Brian Moore to send his first manuscript to Andre Deutsch, I think it's pronounced, which is where he published his first book, Acrobats. He also, once he was in the Calgary archival world, which was, and I'll tell you a little bit about the acquisition and why it was a benefit to authors. He also said, you know, Brian, you should get your archives in Calgary as well, because this was a revenue stream for authors.
I was going to say, so these weren't gifted, these were sold.
That's right. And it is part of this let's go for it, Canada, yay Canada time. So what they would do is Dr. Kenneth Glazier, who was the university librarian and a very erudite and ambitious university librarian, he was contacted by Dr. Halvard Dolly, who was a scholar of Brian Moore. And Dr. Dolly and Mordecai Richler sort of said, hey, here's the next person you should get. So in the 70s, it was this very active time of let's get so-and-so. So they got Canadian composers, Canadian architects, Canadian writers. So, you know, some really brilliant Canadians started to be collected. And at the time, there was money around, or money could be raised to buy the archives of authors. And then there were government matching programs to help pay the rest of this. So now in Canada, most literary archives in a public institution would be donated for a tax receipt. At that time, it was a payment. And those days are gone now of buying archives in Canada, but that's not the case, say, in the United States, because Brian Moore's final accrual of archives actually went to Austin, Texas.
Which is the extraordinary thing about him as a writer, that he has three distinct identities. He is the Belfast writer, he is the Canadian writer, and then there's the Californian writer as well. And so what is in the archive in Calgary is this period really from 48, as he's starting to write, up until 1967-ish, when he goes to California.
Well, actually, it covers 1946 up to about 1985.
Okay, so it's extensive.
And then there were two main accruals in 75 and 85. And then following his death, the family placed the rest of the materials at Austin, Texas. So the era of his writing, or of his archival materials, is definitely the analog era. And I love this era of authors' archives because it is so tangible to see the process of writing and revision, the correspondence that, you know, was sent back and forth between people and with publishers. And you see how very active people's social networks were, the volume of mail people must have received, the intensity of interaction around being a writer in the mid-century and into the 70s and 80s. And you can see, and I'll show you examples of his materials. What I love about writers in the 50s, 60s, 70s is they literally cut and paste passages with tape and paper, and the editing is so visual and so present in a way that is very different to appreciate in an electronic era, when, unless the person is a compulsive revision, like version controller, and you are interested in reading track changes, it is not the same experience to consult a writer's archive in later years. There isn't that real, in my mind, immediacy. So this is the Brian Moore up until about 85. And I don't know, so that would be around the time of Black Robe.
Yeah, yeah. So that's...
Those later novels, their creation is represented in Texas. So that would be really good for people to kind of have a different perspective. It's fun to see a writer evolve through handwriting, through different typewriters, onto word processing. The archive that is the most heavily used in Calgary is Alice Munro, the great Canadian short story writer. I'm very familiar with her materials, and they are of a similar era.
Can I just say, I must interrupt you just to say, if you don't mind, as we're talking and you're telling me about that and about Brian Moore his working methods up until the 1980s, I started writing my first novel in 1985.
Okay.
I'm sitting at a little yellow top Formica table, which suddenly I remembered is very like the one I worked at. And I had a very large electric typewriter that I thought was going to be brilliant for me. It was about the size of the desk, and every time you hit return, the whole table would shake. So I would sit with my knees kind of jammed underneath it, and the floor would shake beneath me, and people who I was sharing the house with, the light fittings would shake every time I hit return. So as you were telling me that, I could feel my knees back up under the table, trying to stop everything from shaking. And it is a very different experience writing on that kind of on typewriter like that. So I mean, you've shown me some of the stuff that's in the archive, and we will talk a little bit more about what all is in there. I'm looking at there's boxes behind you there. That's not any of the. Is that it?
This is to show you that we're not some fly-by-night operation here. This is my office, so I'm in the archives, but I'm not in the archives. But I requested about 20 boxes to look through of Brian Moore's stuff. Now, how do we measure the size of an archive in Canada? If we were to line up the boxes like that, we would have 9 meters of Brian Moore. That's
incredible.
And then there's 14 feet in Texas because American archivists measure differently. So Brian Moore is 9 meters, and we have about 11 kilometers of archives in Calgary. So those are some acid-free Brian Moore archival boxes. You see the red dots on some of the boxes. That indicates a restricted file. So the method of archival processing that was used in the 70s, 80s, and 90s here was that when there were documents that dealt in detail with an author's finances, or if correspondence was deemed particularly personal, certain files would be restricted for a certain amount of time. So if there were very private letters between an author and someone else, they could say, oh, please don't make those available. But in Brian Moore's case, the restricted files generally are to do with royalty statements or legal contracts for each of his books. And I will say Brian Moore was an excellent record keeper and totally orderly, and beyond orderly, deeply courteous and generous as a provider of archives, because he provided summary and contextual information about the different parts of the archive. And I can tell you that is very rare, particularly in poets, but and in prose writers as well. What I love about the Brian Moore materials, and it's been a treasure to review them for this festival, you know, whenever I read a little bit about Brian Moore's life, they emphasize the strictness and the harshness of his school. And I think his school was called St. Malachy's.
Yeah.
And how he had this sense that he wasn't a successful scholar because of the trouble with maths, which we would call math. And I thought, that's a shame, because he was so scholarly, and he was so well trained, and his penmanship was beautiful. And I'll show you some examples, but it's an absolute joy to read his handwriting and to look through his documents. And then he has a very sort of metacognitive approach to his writing, as when he submitted the things to the archives in the 70s, he wrote these little summary cards like, and this is what I wrote after the first draft of this work. And here's how this thing started. And, you know, when I was going up in literary studies and the author had died and all that, you weren't really encouraged to want to look under the hood and say, well, what did the author want to write? What was he trying? What was he thinking about? What started? Like, that was all, forget it. What a breath of fresh air to look at this archive, because he's like, okay, I had a dream and I wrote the Great Victorian Collection because of this dream, you know? And then after a draft of something, he's like, now this is the first draft and here's what I'm going to try to work on in the second. Like, it's so transparent. It makes it such a gift to scholars, to biographers, but also just to people who are interested in how writing happens. So that kind of transparency and description is rare in writers, at least in the archives I've worked with, who tend to give you everything, but depending on the personality or the type of writing, may not put the effort into saying, and here's what we're going for with this, or here's what I thought, or even here's a file folder. So Brian Moore's stuff is in fantastic condition. You,
in advance of this, I know you were working Saturday evening because you sent me an email from the archive. You were preparing for this, and so was I. That's how I saw the email come in on Saturday evening. But you sent me his notes on the lonely passion of Judith Hearne. So, and maybe just to locate Judith Hearne in his writing career, it's what he considers his first novel, but it's not the first thing that he wrote that was published. He had been writing short fiction. He'd been a working journalist as well, but he'd also very particularly been writing pulp fiction under a couple of pen names. I think Bernard Mara, is that one of them?
And Michael Bryan.
Right, yeah. So he's published a couple of those after moving to Canada, but then he starts work on what will be his first novel, published in the UK and Ireland by Deutsch, which is The Lonely Passion of Judith Hearne. And you sent me his notes for that, which are incredible. There are 7 pages of notes that he gave. I guess he wrote those for the archive. Is that right, to support the material going into the archive?
That's right. So we'll have a fantastic box. So he was all about the origin story. Like, he was very transparent about how particular works came to be and to show their evolution. And so he typed up this, 7-page account of how Judith Hearne was written. What fascinates me about the account, and this really speaks to the way writers make a living, is the variety of sources of funding they need to scrape together in order to write what they consider their real writing. So Judith Hearne began with a short story that he wrote while he's a proofreader at the Montreal Gazette. So that's the Montreal's big English language daily. Then he moves along and one summer rents a cottage up in the Laurentians, 25 miles from Montreal. And there he starts to work away alone all week, writing what will be Judith Hearne. And as he's writing that first draft, I read elsewhere that he kind of went into a trance and was totally focused for the first 100 pages. Being alone in this cabin, which is very Canadian to sit in a cabin and write something, but perhaps also very darkly Canadian and possibly Irish, to then be out swimming one day and pulling your rowboat along and a boat comes and crashes into you when you're 100 pages into your first novel. And he provides this account of this passing motorboat crashing into him, and I can speak from experience. Montreal is a wonderful place to have a head injury because they have a wonderful neurological institute. And I myself in Montreal fell on my head and experienced this world-class care. So I feel seen, when
So he was hit by a speedboat or
yes.
motorboat while he's out swimming and towing his rowing boat.
And you finally get up to your cabin in the woods, you're finally writing your first novel, and he has this terrible injury with fractures to his skull. So he goes from this idyllic writing time where on the weekends his friends and his first wife Jacqueline come up, and Mordecai Richler's there, and Bill Weintraub, and I'm imagining boozy fun nights in the Canadian lakeshore. And then this terrible boating accident happens, and he provides this account, and then he's like, and then I recovered, and then I was writing again, and I had to write these pulp novels, and the pulps earned him a good amount of money. He would get paid up front $2,000, $2,500, which in the 50s is decent. Yeah. And then he would, so what I find interesting is that he had this very serious purpose with Judith Hearne about, an individual who's isolated and a bit deluded and suffers from certain repressions in her life. And then he's on the side writing these thrillers, which he doesn't value highly, but he does it to make money, and he's successful. He publishes 7 of them. So there are these kind of streams going on as he's writing it, and he very helpfully kept specific diaries, and I have the diaries here. So he kept these page a day.
Oh my goodness, look at that.
Diaries, and what he's up to, what he's writing. So
can we see some of that? Oh, look at that.
So you can see here we've got winter 1954. And he says which chapters he's working on which day.
Oh my goodness, right.
And then
that's the Judith Hearne rewrite. So that's it. That's 1954. He's finishing off Judith Hearne, or he's revising Judith Hearne.
That's right. And then he'll say what other things he's working on, what money is coming in from different freelance and sort of job work. And I'll show you a slide of this later, but here's a poignant page. Oh gosh. At the back of his 1954 journal, he keeps track of his rejections for Judith Hearne. So those are all the publishers that turned down Judith Hearne.
My goodness.
So ultimately it was Andre Deutsch in Britain and Atlantic in the States and Collins in Canada that went for Judith Hearne. It was the Americans who thought he wouldn't make a good enough launch or splash with the title Judith Hearne. It was the Americans who added The Lonely Passion of, which sort of took over in the Canadian edition to be the title. So it's a really great day by day, blow by blow account of the life of a writer, and it continues on, and then he starts working on his next novel while Judith Hearne's being revised by publishers.
Yeah, and so he does begin that. I think he mentions that in those pages that you'd sent to me anyway, and again several things about it. That $2,500 that he's getting for upfront for those pulp novels still doesn't look terribly unattractive nowadays, I think, to a lot of people. And he does talk about kind of dashing things off so he can get back to Judith Hearne. But I mean, it is about making what I would call making the life rather than the living. How do you surround yourself with all the things that you need to allow you to carry on the work, and of course the thing with Judith Hearne as a novel, not just as the first novel in particular, stylistically it's a really, really extraordinary novel to read again, even today, coming back to it, and you think it's a really quite innovative novel in its narrative techniques. So there's an awful lot for a writer who has been writing pulp fiction. This is clearly quite a departure in terms of style.
It is, and I had never read Judith Hearne because when I grew up, I just thought Canadian literature, it's too depressing. Who can take it? Of course, then I go to university and study it intensely, and then I love it. But my mom read all of Brian Moore, so I always thought these dreary books, then you work with the materials, you have a different view of them. When you approach an author through their archive, very different from a reader. But rereading Judith Hearne now for this is quite something. When he describes the sort of trance he was in to write as he was working on the first draft, I would say as a reader, I felt the trance reading it. It is a heavy atmospheric detail, the detail of the sort of the squalor of the boarding house. It reminded me of reading The Dubliners for the first time. And how fresh the writing is still, even though it's definitely of a place and a time. I will tell you that I myself, a woman in my young 40s, recently moved house. And as I'm sitting there looking around my new surroundings, the book I'm reading is Judith Hearne. And I'm like, it's me and my cats and this new boxes. And I'm like, and I'm thinking, oh, there's some awkward parallels here. But absolutely a compelling, tight first novel, and that has aged well. And I remember seeing a note in the archive, his publishers sending him a note of congratulations saying, well done, Judith Hearne has been in print for 30 years so far. And so this is one of the things about Brian Moore, who is at once beloved and appreciated and underappreciated, perhaps due to the diasporic sort of experience he had. But the wonderful thing about a literary archive is that it allows people to fully explore a writer's career and trajectory. And a centenary offers a potential for more appreciation or reappraisal. Often in archives, there are ebbs and flows of interest in an archive over the course of an author's life. And I would say a centenary sort of brings an author up into the consciousness again in a more direct way, and can sometimes encourage new revisitations of that work. So
sorry, if I can just come in on that. I mean, I think there's so much about you were saying about Judith Hearne and it being very much of its time and place. I've lived most of my life in Belfast. I was born in 1961, so not too many years after Judith Hearne, and a lot of that is very, very recognizable. That the city of the immediate post-war era. There's so much about the atmosphere is very familiar, and of course it's changed quite considerably. One of the things, again, from the archive and from those pages that you sent me, the fact that he started it as a short story, and he said when he did the after the first 100 pages getting hit unfortunately by the speedboat, he said the thing that he hadn't done was bring it to a resolution. And that was really interesting to me, because rereading it again, I was reminded just of the beautiful shape of it as a novel. And although nobody wants to get hit by a speedboat, clearly there's something in that rethinking, reimagining the short story creates this really, really beautifully shaped novel. It's really interesting to read that little summary that he gives for the archive.
And if I could show a couple more
Please
things.
do. Please
about
do.
Judith Hearne. One of the charming pages he provided on sort of that crinkly oniony paper is he wanted to explain that there was no final draft manuscript that he had to offer for Judith Hearne. It was lost or thrown away at Deutsch. He wrote them at the time of getting his archive ready to say, hey, do you have it? And then in 1974, someone at the publishing house wrote to say, I have instituted a search both here and at Little Brown for the manuscript of Judith Hearne. Unfortunately, it is not here or there. I'm sorry, but we will certainly keep our eyes open should it be lurking in some out of the way corner. So the things that scholars and archivists would dearly prize is lost. And so, but he was a beginner writer and he didn't know that he could ask for it back. So he really demonstrates, his apprenticeship as a serious writer. And the way he carefully kept records about it suggests to me a kind of insight or awareness that he was a serious writer in the making, and his careful documentation of the work shows that. So he has a folder called Judith Hearne Preparatory Work, and here he lists the characters who are in the story.
Oh.
Can
I see that again? Are you going to give us that as a slide? Because
well, what I'll do is I'm going to press it right up to the screen, and you can have it.
Yeah, do that just for a moment. Okay, that's
okay.
Fine. Yeah.
Here's something very fascinating. So the real Judith Hearne, there was a character, there was a woman, a real woman in Belfast who inspired him to create Judith Hearne. And her name was also Judith, last name Keogh. I don't know how to say that.
Keogh.
Okay. So this was so in Judith Hearne goes to visit the McNeils. The O'Neills?
The
O'Neills.
Yeah.
And then that was based on the Moore family and this woman who'd come to visit. And this woman who wore red. And then Brian had a sister whose name I shan't dare pronounce. Eibhlin.
Evelyn. I'm going to say Evelyn.
Okay. I was guessing all kinds of things. My sister, Evelyn, knew more about the real Miss Keogh, the character on whom I loosely based Miss Hearne, than I did. I wrote to her in 1953 and she sent me these splendid notes. And the sister types out this multi-page account of this Miss Keogh. And Brian Moore saved it and put it in the archive. And now hold on to your hat. Here comes a fun archive story. So this summer, I was on sabbatical. I came back after a year away. Talking to the staff, I said, oh, I'm up to this new thing with Brian Moore, da-da-da. And my colleague Allison said, oh, well, a descendant of Miss Keogh found out we had some stuff about her in the archive and wrote to me. And we found these papers. And so the real life relative is a fellow who lives in Dublin, who we've recently been providing everything we know about Miss Keogh, who's a real person, and sent a real postcard, which is in the archive. So he carefully documents all of these steps, and this is on very fading and yellowing typewriter paper. And then he has the original short story, genesis of book written as story while I was proofreader at the Montreal Gazette, 1951 on, later revised 1953. It was called A Friend of the Family. So if you're someone who likes origin stories and the genesis of things, he really tells you the whole scoop. Here he says another attempt at the story. Like his little annotations, I find them so charming and helpful, and then an early beginning of the story. So like many writers, he was thankfully a compulsive editor and reviser, worked very hard on it, but also was careful and committed to sharing the process. I can tell you other writers do not like to share early drafts or fragments. They tend to send along maybe work that's further developed. So what is included in an archive, it's never this total thing that will tell you everything. There's always selection at play. And the selection can be from the author themselves, can be from their family members and what they choose to include. It can be due to circumstance, if very sadly, if a fire destroys a home or a flood, or if there's a loss or the person had to move and things get lost. So archives really do amazing work to preserve these kinds of things.
Sorry. I was just going back to what you held up there and some of those things you've been showing us. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is, especially in the very early stages of a writing life, not that these feelings ever leave you, I don't think, but that the need to encourage yourself, because after all, who else is there? Nobody's really waiting for this. I mean, yeah, he's friends with Mordecai Richler, and you know, he does know a couple of writers, but you know, there's some of those little notes are actually quite encouraging to me as a writer, and I suspect to other writers who might watch this or who might come to the archive to see, you know, those things, maybe notes that are written just to say, you know, here we go again, give it another go. And that is really quite interesting to see it. Thinking about how you do things yourself.
And I can tell he would have been a great writing teacher at UCLA, where he spent so many years teaching writing, but that job also allowed him to immerse so fully in his own novel writing and his research process. And he made remarks, if I could share some of his words. He came up to the University of Calgary in November 1975. They used to have sort of little ceremonies to say, yay, the archive is here. And pictures would be taken, and I'm sure wine would be sipped and crackers. But he gave a little speech, and lovely, we have this, is this a 1/4-inch recording? Yes, we have a 1/4-inch recording, which now I wish I will have digitized of his speech, because I would love to hear his voice, but he did have a transcript of what he had planned to say. And what he often talks about is sort of the isolation and the loneliness of the writer, and then what happens to your stuff after. So he cites Jacques Rivière, a French critic, about what happens to a novelist in relation to his work once the writing of it is over. And then he goes on to say, you know, at this time, I've written 10 novels and 2 books of nonfiction. As I finish each book and send it off to the publisher, I'm very much like the novelist described in Rivière's quotation. I put the various drafts and notes away in a cupboard, and I sit down and think about what I'm going to do next. 9 months later, the book is printed and reviewed and read by people in Canada and England and America and other countries. The book is no longer mine. It has assumed a life of its own. And then he goes on to talk about the archival remains. What remains for me are the notes, the various drafts, the correspondence with editors and publishers, and the final completed draft of the book. They lie in a cupboard in my workroom, as in a grave, a vague reminder of the struggles and intensities which went into making up that half shelf of books which has been my life's work. There, yellowing, forgotten by everyone but me, are perhaps as many as 5 drafts of a particular novel. And once in a long time, I would open up the cupboards and think that someone interested should look at these drafts. for they, more than any criticism or article or book, tell how that particular novel reached its final form. And then one day someone did show up. One day Dr. Glazier appeared in my workroom and the cupboards were opened and inspected. And a few months later, the moving men came with great ceremony and packed my past into 8 cardboard boxes, and I signed a receipt. Suddenly the cupboards were bare and I felt a great lightness of heart. In some way, I was no longer alone, like a Beckett character, scribbling away among the detritus of my former efforts. Suddenly those papers and drafts, the original books, have been rescued from the grave of those cupboards and trunks. So it clearly meant a lot to him for his archives to be preserved. And certainly it meant a lot to Calgary to have the archive of such a writer here, who really, he didn't hold back in what he shared from his writing. Some authors include a lot of personal things as well, like photos or even strange objects that come in boxes and things you think, really? But
I'm going to make a little note here about strange objects. Talk away there. Just what I do. No strange objects in boxes. Okay.
When the Glenn Patterson archive is being prepared for transfer, you know, just remember this conversation.
Okay.
So he was very reflective about, you know, the life of the writer, and it's wonderful to read his correspondence and interactions as his career became more successful and as he had better means. You know, the house in California, which was rented, eventually is purchased, then it is renovated, and his quality of life is very good. And then I read a wonderful letter about, he's telling his editor, one of the American editors, he's like, here's an important update. I've acquired a Mercedes, you know, he gives the model. And what I love about that California time in his life is the friendships he had with people in working in the Hollywood industry, but also writers. And particularly, I was so moved because that was the time of Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn in Malibu. And I thought of Joan Didion's yellow Corvette Stingray, and then Brian Moore in his Mercedes. And I always wondered, did he ever ride in the Corvette? And I actually found a really thoughtful couple of letters from Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn. The way correspondence took place back then, you know, you have a thoughtful writer like Joan Didion writing a thoughtful little note on her letterhead to her friend. And this was after the novel Fergus was published. And she writes this perfect little Didion letter. And she's admiring his technical abilities in bringing about the story. And then she said, above that, the book made me sad. It is about exactly that situation in which most of us find ourselves. I read it last night and have been flooded all day with the sense of how much we forget and how little, for those of us who have not found it meaningful, any of it counted, with the sense of encountering the dead and the living and my misapprehension of both. It is a very beautiful and distilled book, almost an abstract of all human emotion. Like, what a letter to get. Wow. On May 1st, 1970. So the richness of his friendships, the detail of correspondence between him and his editors. I was reading this great exchange, many, many letters to determine the title of the novel that became The Mangan Inheritance. Showed me the really collaborative way he worked with editors, which I think the average reader doesn't know that backstory. So this is a very rich archive.
The way it works with me is I suggest that I tell my editor what the title is, and he says no. And then he tells me what it is. And I go, oh, well, who knew that? That's very interesting. We could talk for so long about this. It's extraordinary what those little snippets that we've been able to see. and that you've read. If a person did want to see the whole 9 meters, not yards, but the whole 9 meters of it, are people able to come in? I'm guessing. Well, I know some of the biographers, so I'm guessing people have been there and looked at it. But interested readers able to come and access any of that archive?
Absolutely, and I've made a few slides that I can share that has some links and some email addresses that will help people. And what I will say is, on August 30th, we're sort of back open after COVID. Anyone can waltz into our reading room again and look at materials, but what if you live in Belfast and you're a super fan of Brian Moore? So I'd like to share links to the finding aids that people can look at, email addresses of those of us who work here, because what we've been doing during COVID and what we do for long distance researchers is help them identify the specific materials they may be interested in, provide them scans or copies. So the archive is very much open to all who are interested. You do not need a letter of introduction or any sort of formal credentials or initials behind your name. These archives are in a public institution. We will show you anything unless it has a red dot.
Okay.
And so
we want to see the red dots. You know that I'm sitting there, I'm looking at the ones with the red dots, and I'm thinking, really want to know what's in. And tell me, because you said financial things were sometimes in there, because unless that stuff you sent us came from a red dot box, he's pretty frank about his payments, and I think that's healthy. It's healthy to talk about what you're being paid. You have to make a living.
And it was more of an archival decision about the red dots, just because of privacy, because these were living people. And it's like, do we want Mordecai Richler's bank book to be totally publicly available? Perhaps not. But Mordecai Richler, very much like Brian Moore, in his diaries, I thought, oh, the diaries of Mordecai Richler, I'm going to learn everything. No, it was like, made $1,000 on this day, paid $250, and I was like, oh, I thought I would learn everything. But there is this great transparency, and Brian Moore puts in his account books and his diaries, the money coming in, and so it is a very open archive, other than these, few banking documents. As time goes by, those documents are less sensitive. And I don't know if the red dots last forever or what the arrangement is. I would have to ask some of the archivists what the policy is on that. But people are very welcome to consult this archive. It has been beautifully ordered by the author. It was professionally and at an item level described back in the heydays of the 70s, when you could describe an archive down to the item. This would not take place now. We'd maybe go down to the folder level and say, there are 9 letters in here. This one is like, this letter is about. So there's a wealth of information here in Calgary and also in Austin, Texas, if anyone wants to pursue a line of inquiry about Brian Moore. So I welcome everyone who wants to learn more. But as you've shown us Camden Street, I hope you're convinced that this is a credible operation here. Would you like me to show the slide that would at least show people how they might get in touch with the archive?
I would love you to show the slide, and whether we're going to put that up at the very, very end. Well, do you know what? We're just going to do it now.
Okay.
You go.
I would like to say that I made some scans, and the lovely Jean Moore gave permission to share them. And then those are the rejections. Oh, he kept a beautiful commonplace book of quotations that inspired each of his works, which is great because you always wonder what a writer is reading as they write something. This is a first draft. This is a note he wrote about his first draft.
Oh my goodness.
He had been calling it divine. It's like a student writing an essay kind of assessing, how it's gone so far. In the second draft, now to be written, I must clarify these conflicts, correct my own ambivalence towards divine. Like it's very interesting. And then, like many authors, he kept scrapbooks of his reviews. This one I loved because it's called Ding Dong School Book. I don't know, did we all go to Ding Dong School? Perhaps. But in this book, he used a literary clipping service, and he kept every review in every paper all over the world. And most writers in that era did that. And it is a blessing for scholars because not all newspapers are well indexed or provide a full text review. So authors' archives have tremendous value in what they have preserved about their own work. This is his little note. The Great Victorian Collection began with a dream. And so these are some of his progress notes on, and you can see his beautiful script that he wrote in, and little updates over time about the progress of the work. Here's a very beautiful, this is a second draft of the Great Victorian Collection. And he has one of those label guns, and he's typed out second draft. That's a conservation nightmare, I can tell you. Also Scotch tape, and the cutting and pasting is a nightmare for preserving papers, but this is how people worked. Alice Munro used this same technique. She would put paragraphs over top and really move the parts of her stories around. So I think if anyone visits Calgary, they would also do well to dive into Alice Munro's archive. Why not? Some thoughts about Fergus in his beautiful sort of italic script. And then here we have some URLs. How do we get to search the Brian? Oh, I did it, a Canadian, Brian Moore. I also had a boyfriend called Brian. That must be it. And then there's my email address, amurr@ucalgary.ca, or my colleague at speccol@ucalgary.ca. You could write either address and we will talk to you about this. I've also provided a link to the Harry Ransom Center because they have an online finding aid. So if you were keen about, say, The Color of Blood, Lies of Silence, No Other Life, The Statement, and The Magician's Wife, all the later career work, that would be in Texas. So a few pointers for people, but mostly I just want you to know we are here in Calgary to answer any questions you may have to help you celebrate this centenary.
Annie, can I just say that talking to you it's been brilliant talking to you and to hear your enthusiasm and indeed passion for Brian Moore and his work and about the archive. And it's just been wonderful. I want to thank you. It's been brilliant talking to you. I really look forward to getting to Calgary and to having a look at some of that material. Let's face it, everybody wants to get out of wherever they are at the minute. We're all looking forward to being somewhere else, but I very particularly would love to do that. It's been a complete joy to be thinking about and reading Brian Moore. And as I say, I'm going to do this one more time. I'm going to slip down there. That's Camden Street. That's where Judith Hearne starts the novel, taking out the picture of her aunt and the Sacred Heart, and in her new lodgings. But it's been absolutely wonderful chatting to you today. So thank you so much, and thank you to everybody at Paradoso for this brilliant festival. I was going to say it's very timely, but of course it's timely. It's the centenary. When else were you going to have the centenary festival but now? But thank you so much. Thank you.